I will give my perspective to a few questions that arose from my last video entitled Evidence of God and Purpose of Life. While that video was about God, the creator and sustainer of everything, this video is about having created everything, God relating to us personally. Let's look at the questions that arose. Question 1 being, if there is a just and loving God, why do we see so much evil and suffering in this world? Let's look at the evil aspect first and then come to the suffering aspect. On a daily basis, every minute ticking, we see 99% of our moms and dads wake up and take loving care of their children. So many take loving care of aged. Those who work in hospitals lovingly take care of patients. Teachers work hard to teach and educate our children. At workplaces too, generally, workers treat their fellow colleagues with love, which means we see so much of good every minute passing by. Do we see evil? Yes, of course. We see evil acts too, but comparatively, very much fewer. Hence the statement that there is so much evil is not very true. Therefore, perhaps the statement could be rephrased from why so much of evil to why do we see evil on this earth? Well, we need to go to the fundamentals to answer this question. Our purpose of life is to glorify God, which is to love God and God's creation, you and I included. True love is totally and fully manifested in a situation which possesses the characteristic of freedom, free will, the ability to choose to love or not to love. As the purpose of life is to love God, we are bestowed with the ability to make that choice, to choose to love or not, and perfect our love for God. If we were created to compel to love God without the freedom not to love, then we would be kind of robots. And in such a situation, true love cannot happen. Hence, as we have with us this freedom to love God, glorify God, which is to love God's creation and do good, we also have the freedom not to love God, which is, in other words, the freedom to glorify oneself, which is sin or evil. Practically, love is visible from birth to death, as I mentioned before. So is the freedom to love or not, which we exercise. For example, if we see an injured or needy person asking for our help, we can choose to stop and help the person, or we can choose to ignore the person, think of an excuse, prioritize our activity, and get by. Prioritizing our activity is placing ourselves first, which is glorifying ourselves. So here we see how we exercised our freedom not to love or to love. Similar to the unraveling of the laws of nature occurring uninterrupted throughout ages, the rules associated with freedom takes place uninterrupted too. Hence, if one chooses to glorify oneself instead of God, which is to do evil, one has the freedom to do so. Therefore, we see evil acts. and they could give rise to pain and resulting suffering even to the innocent. If there is no justice for the victims of such acts, this sounds unfair. I will discuss the justice aspect shortly. I will also come to the biological and natural factors that give rise to pain and resulting suffering later on this presentation. Hence, to have a situation of true love is to have a situation where we could freely choose to love. Our purpose of life being glorifying God, to love God and His creation, we are bestowed with the freedom to love, to perfect our love and achieve our purpose in life. Therefore, with it, we also have the freedom to glorify ourselves, which is to do evil. Hence, we see good and evil side by side. Consequence of evil is pain and resulting suffering. Let's look at the structure of freedom, the structure of good and evil. We were created for love, to love, and be loved. Love has the ability to make choices. It possesses the characteristic of freedom. Freedom, though, is not the ability to do anything. For example, I cannot exercise that freedom to say, punch a person walking at night. If I do so, that act will diminish the freedom of the person who walked, as he would now be afraid to exercise his freedom of walking at night. Hence, clearly, freedom works within a structure. It has a purpose. It is a moral concept. Obviously, the concept and structure for it to prevail and monitored has to come from somewhere or someone. Where does that come from? The very question about evil tells us when there is something as bad or evil, then the other side of that is there is something as good. If so, there has to be a method of rules to differentiate good and evil, which then requires someone to provide and monitor the rules. From where does that come? Needless to say, the structure and concept of freedom, good and evil, relate to God and our moral code. If we were to consider that there is no God, we are then just a bunch of chemicals. And in that case, what would be the world we want? Where does good and bad come from? Why is good good or bad bad? For example, if two persons were traveling alone on a train, one pickpockets the other and takes away $100. Why is it wrong? After all, it's one bunch of chemicals acting in a particular manner. There is no moral code to say right or wrong. Some try to reason out that for humans to coexist in a manner that enables them to propagate themselves, laws become necessary and hence have evolved. The issue is, if one is nothing more than a bunch of meaningless chemicals, first, what is the requirement for collaborative propagation? Each chemical makeup could exhibit their own properties. Further, if propagation is the need, for example, if a chemical configuration decide that chemical configurations aged over 65 years are not required for propagation and are a burden to other chemical configurations and hence should be eliminated, there is no moral code or reasoning to negate it. A good proportion of our children, so called chemical compositions, certainly will not allow it. Why? Because they love us, love the reason. Certainly, deep inside, we all cling to a higher moral code and differentiate good from bad. Hence, this paradox or the very question about the existence of evil, why is there evil? Because of true love and the freedom we have to love or not. The concept and structure of freedom, from where does that come? The reasoning for good to be good and the laws to differentiate it, from where did that come? Etc., etc. All in fact point strongly towards an intelligent, personal, loving God rather than a chance occurrence. Further, it is a practically meaningful worldview to live by and live for. Commenting on the justice aspect for pain and suffering caused by evil acts, let's say a careless driver caused an accident and a child is taken to hospital seriously injured. The issue is, why should this innocent child suffer? What is visible immediately after is the near and dear flocking together in strength and love. Love is raised to a different level. There is pain and grief, but love strengthens. Even if the person is injured for life, yet to those who encounter the injured, starting from the near and dear to a casual encounter, their lives are touched and transformed, even in the slightest way. The injured person, by his or her very presence, contributes to raising love, touching and transforming lives, and so good is brought out. Justice has to be looked at from the point of view of life's goal, which is glorifying God and getting nearer to that goal, not glorifying oneself. If raising love, bringing out good is the objective in life, then the injured person could be seen to have been given a comparative advantage, a head start, and not a disadvantage. As pain and suffering undergone by the injured is not in vain. It is enabling so many to transform their lives and bring out good. It could be a stepping stone for greater good. The potential to bring out good has been enhanced. Any situation is a situation to be accepted with love and courage. Every situation has intrinsic value in it. All we need is to look around to see the good being brought out from such situations. From an earthly paradigm of making money, enhancing wealth, personal glorification, one could view the injury such as to the child as unjust. However, a Christian perspective of an enhanced potential to glorify God is always progressive. Another point is justice as we want it to be versus true, real God's justice could be two different things. I am sure you would have come across many instances when you perceived to be bad at that moment, after some time turns out to be a blessing in disguise or good. Similarly, what we see as unfair at that moment could be for our greater betterment, and in that case, not unfair as we initially perceived. If we take another example, if a suicide bomber kills or injures 100 innocent bystanders, the question is, where is the justice for the innocent and the dead when the perpetrator and the dead are all now dead? In a worldview with God at the center, we are assured of true love and justice to all those, the living, the injured and the affected, and the dead as well. Further, good will be brought out from that situation too. It's a worldview that the affected can take solace in. In a worldview where there is no God, in a suicide bombing situation, the lives injured and the lives lost are injured or lost without justice. It's just gone. Human life is lowered to animal kingdom status. It is a meaningless view to live by. Let's look at suffering. The Bible tells us that man created for love with free will fell to temptation and chose to glorify himself. With it came separation from God, and with it came suffering. The well known Adam and Eve story. Life is about love. It's a love story. We personally need to reflect back and see the love and joy we have undergone in our own lives. The love we have encountered, the love we have shared, isn't it a love story worth living? Of course, we might have encountered some suffering. If life was to be not a love story, but another story, such as a suffering story, we would not even want to have children, as our children's life will be about suffering. Practically, we don't live like that. On the contrary, we want to have children. A mother undergoes labor pain and related suffering knowingly, but accepts happily for love of the baby. We lovingly have them. And any parent will vouch for the level of love one is raised to when they hear that cry of a new baby. We nurture them lovingly. We want them to be loving beings in society. We see children through both their joy and suffering with love. If we were asked to live again or just disappear, I reckon the vast majority will select to live again. Life is a love story from the start. We are medically making advances to relieve pain, minimize pain and suffering. Hence, comparatively, we have distant physical suffering caused by pain to a great extent. So much so that there are persons who go through life without encountering physical suffering caused by pain. Physical suffering caused by impairment too is being worked on. Various technologies being integrated to reduce the impact of impairment and thereby resulting suffering. Even though we are working to distance suffering, today too there is suffering due to pain and impairment. In addition, we have the psychological suffering due to grief, sorrow, regret, and so on. So, what is the purpose of suffering? Our nerves enable us to have pain, which warns us of greater danger. Pain is a necessity. Too much pain is the issue. Pain and resulting suffering, in some instances, we need to undergo for future good. For example, a surgery brings about good, a vaccination brings about greater good. Similarly, emotional pain too is required to build up and make one more resilient. Hence, it is clear pain and suffering to some extent is required and it brings future good. Suffering helps us understand our vulnerability. It destroys our pride, which is to glorify oneself. Our hearts soften when we see and feel suffering. It's an opportunity to rediscover love, compassion, and redefine ourselves. Suffering enables us to suffer together in oneness. It perfects and raises love. It brings about repentance and renewal. Suffering provides us an opportunity to find God, to love God, and glorify God. If we love someone deeply, we are willing even to sacrifice our lives and face death. This could bring about suffering. Suffering tests our love. It's a training to love. God expressed his love through suffering on the cross. The purpose of suffering was love. So, the role of suffering is to learn and teach the love of God as well as to perfect the love of God and submission to his will. Now, what would be the worldview on the purpose of suffering in a chance creation? I hope I have sufficiently explained with examples that we were created for love, and with that we are bestowed with the freedom to love or do evil, and hence we see evil on this earth. Evil gives rise to pain and suffering. We also see pain and suffering due to natural events and biological causes. However, we are assured that God will bring about good from any evil act, and all associated to it will have justice. Suffering helps us to perfect love of God and submission to his will. A practical, coherent worldview to live for and live by. A somewhat related short question that arose is, we live in an imperfect world, and an intelligent designer will not design something imperfect. With regards to imperfectness, it is as perceived by us humans. We could be unaware of how what we perceive to be imperfect contributes to perfectness, like in the case of evil, pain, and suffering explained before. The very thought of imperfectness tells us that we are comparing it with perfectness, which is being in the eternal presence and love of God. A brief comment regards natural disasters. Natural events such as floods, volcanic activity, earthquakes, etc., have beneficial aspects to it. Flood brings in nutrients. Natural events are awe-inspiring and brings in beauty. It's when it affects us, the human being, and brings pain and suffering, that there is an issue. I addressed pain and suffering before. These natural events do not tell anything about perfectness or imperfectness. It's just the laws of nature manifesting itself. Commenting on physical impairment and the notion that our bodies make up is not perfect, including that there is that much disease, etc. Again, as mentioned before, we could be unaware of how what we perceive to be imperfect contributes to perfectness or to the glory of God or purpose in life. Our body has some 37 trillion cells. 37 into 10 to the power 21 chemical reactions per second. That is 37,000 billion chemical reactions per second. So much occurring in our bodies. To this, we have 7 billion people. If we look at it like this, one cannot be but awed by the magnificent accuracy and sheer precision of the activities occurring despite the astronomical volume. There is disease and impairment that arises, and yes, when affected directly or indirectly, it could result in pain and suffering, which has its own reasons and positives for its prevalence, some as explained before. I would make note here, in all these cases, the opportunity to glorify God is much enhanced. We see our vulnerability, a perspective to our lives, and an opportunity to serve. I will take this opportunity to address two other short questions that arose, though not related to the previous discussion. One being that since there could be trillions of universes, hence a universe such as ours and planet Earth as we see it could happen by chance. This worldview, even though lacking in evidence, yes, is plausible. Nevertheless, this argument does not take away the fact that, according to current scientific findings, this universe can be traced back to a starting point, the Big Bang, and is such that is oriented to enable life and humans to have formed and exist. It does not take away the evidence that builds the core argument for a purposeful design and a purpose for our lives. As there exists so much of evidence for a purposeful grand design, one needs to weigh and see the chances of one against the other. The trillions of universe story without the evidence for such, or the one with evidence. If one was to prefer the trillions of universe story, that would require that much greater faith to believe in that rather than the one presented with evidence for a grand design. In addition, these isolated, fragmented assumptions, such as the trillions of universe and hence chance, do not adequately give rise to a holistic, coherent, practically livable world view. The second question that arose is, if there is a creator, who created the creator? It is known that space, time, and matter came to being from and after the start, from and after the Big Bang, as it were. Hence, the creator who created space, time, and matter is outside these dimensions and therefore omnipresent all over space and over time. So there is no chronological order coming into play when something is outside space, time, and matter. And hence, who created the creator or that chronological concept does not arise as it is outside the time dimension. What is noteworthy is that the Bible refers to this very question and answers it saying, God, the creator, is from eternity to eternity, from the beginning of time to the end of time, knowing the present and the future, omnipresent. So the question, who created the creator, has been answered within the Bible in a manner that could be answered, in a manner that could be understood thousands of years ago and now. I bring this presentation to you as an engineer, academic scientist, a sinner, using my knowledge and experience, as well as other internet and knowledge sources, and invite you to rationally reflect on the core theme of this presentation: God, personal God. The question of good and evil, its why and how, the concept and structure of freedom and our moral code, as well as other points with an open mind. The underlying theme being to love God and God's creation, that includes you and I, irrespective of our beliefs, thoughts, and our individual situations.